Hello and welcome to the webinar. Before we get started today, please make sure your microphone is muted and your camera is off. Do you have any questions for our presenters today? Simply use the live Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll get to your questions as soon as possible. The Transport Professionals Association acknowledged the traditional owners and custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. Today's webinar would not be possible without the support of our annual partners, including leadership partners SMEC, Stantec, Beach Lister Consulting, Oricon, PTV Group and Clarity, and Matrix, our strategic partner GHD, and our research partner Ipsos. Today's webinar is recorded and will be made available within your members portal or via email within the next 24 hours. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and we hope you enjoy.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So welcome to Car Parking Reforms Decoded. Now I am joined today by three incredible presenters and we have what I think is going to be an absolutely incredible session if I do say so myself. So my name is Katie Harker. I'll be hosting today's session and we'll be taking you through some of the incredible and interesting reform changes to the Victorian parking. Now, we have quite a jam-packed session today. We will aim to provide you with quite a lot of context about the reforms. And I know that we are joined today by also a lot of participants from outside of Victoria and also participants who may not be completely across the transport area in Victoria and the car parking reforms that we have. And so we're going to start off by taking you through a bit of a regulatory context of what it all is. Then we're going to jump straight into the actual development context of what the reforms mean, what this means for developers, what it means for applicants, and what it means for everyone and their sites. And then we're going to jump into the council's perspective. What does it mean for councils? What can councils do? And what do we need to start taking on board? Now, I'll be joined by three incredible experts who have very kindly volunteered their time to be here today, who are going to share with us everything they know about the reforms, and then they're going to take us through 4 case studies of all different land uses and needs. And then we're going to finish up with hopefully quite a bit of Q&A because I'm assuming there's going to be quite a lot of questions. Now, before I jump in and do a little bit more of an intro, I do want to remind everyone that we are using the Q&A box today. So you'll see that down the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to put any questions in there at any time, and we'll do our best to answer them throughout. When we get to the case study section as well, if you have any questions about the dedicated case studies, feel free to pop those in. However, if we do happen to miss your comment, we will do our best to compile all the questions at the end and get some responses back around to everyone who's attending today. But before I fully jump in, I do need to thank some incredible people who do help us get these sessions up and running. So of course, these sessions would not be possible without the dedication and hard work of some of our incredible industry bodies here in Victoria and Australia who do work tirelessly to help educate us and keep the knowledge sharing going within the profession. And so myself, as the current Vice President of the Transport Professionals Association here in Victoria and Tasmania, and my fellow Transport Professional Association members, we would like to have a massive thank you to VPLA for partnering with us today and for really showcasing that transport is one of the key aspects of the planning system and the sites we have and how we can help everyone shape transport for the future. Now, I would like to introduce our 3 wonderful speakers we have. Again, they have taken their time out to come and join us today. So we're joined by James Deere from 1 Mile Grid, Peter Malley from Ratio, and Chris Coath from Stantec. I would like to give a little intro to each of them now so that you know who exactly is speaking to you. So James Deere is a director with Traffic and Transport and Waste Consultancy 1 Mile Grid. James has broad experience in land use and development planning, working on projects ranging from townhouses through to wind farms and greenfield master planning. He is an advocate for sustainable transport and spends a significant portion of his time away from work in Lycra or in cafes, sometimes concurrently. And then we're also joined by Peter. So Peter is a director at Ratio Consultants and has been a consulting traffic engineer for over 20 years with a passion for master planning and leading his transport engineering expertise to large-scale developments. He has contributed expert advice to a range of significant projects, including town centres, residential subdivisions, mixed-use developments, healthcare, and education facilities throughout his career. Peter has been involved in a variety of major projects, including more than 25 PSP areas across Melbourne, the Parkville and Arden Health Precinct Master Plans, High Point Shopping Centre, multiple Homes Victoria social housing renewal projects, and various residential towers throughout Melbourne. Peter applies a holistic approach to transport planning, including consideration of land uses, opportunities for public transportation, bicycle accessibility, and pedestrian amenity, as well as vehicle accessibility. And lastly, we have Chris Coates from Stantec. So Chris is the practice leader for parking strategy and implementation for Stantec in Australia. He works daily in developing best practice car parking strategies for cities and activity centres across Australia. His work ensures competing activity centre demands of all modes are balanced to achieve resource efficiency, urban design, placemaking, and economic prosperity objectives. More broadly, his skills encompass all major transport planning and traffic engineering areas, and he is a chartered engineer with the Institute of Engineers Australia. Now, to kick off with a bit of a regulatory context and a bit more of an idea of what exactly the reforms are, I'm going to hand over to James Deere from One Mile Grid, who's going to take us through.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate the warm welcome. And it's pleasantly surprising to see so many passionate people joining us in a conversation around car parking provision requirements. So firstly, today, I'll just start off with a bit of context to the changes, acknowledging we've got a lot of people on the line who might not necessarily be practicing in Victoria regularly. So I'll just get some context to I guess what was in place prior to this change. So the car parking provision requirements that apply across Victoria are outlined with clause 52.06 of our planning scheme, and this is common to all councils. So the clause describes two parking provision rates for new developments, column A and column B. Column A are default rates that apply generally is, of course, business, and column B are those that apply in what's known as the principal public transport network area, which is effectively sites within 400 metres of a public transport stop. So a really crude proxy for public transport accessibility. And that change was made in, I think, 2014 from memory. So some select areas do have what's known as a parking overlay applied, which is an additional layer of kind of regulatory control, typically including alternative car parking provision rates or design requirements. And they're generally the result of a strategic plan or study. And they remain in place and will supersede the changes to clause 52.06. And I think importantly, these car parking requirements are all minimum provision requirements. So this is kind of your, I guess, standard predict and provide kind of very traditional model of accommodating for the supply of parking, and is generally set so that the provision of car parking satisfies all demands, kind of typically under the proviso that the parking is free. So this approach kind of tends to hide the cost of true parking and bundles that in with development. And we can kind of see that particularly in a residential context, where you've got, I guess, the costs of providing a basement or a stack of parking being bundled with the price of the house, regardless of whether the person wants it or not. And there's been some great research out of RMIT that established, particularly in kind of inner Melbourne areas, that in the order of 30 to 40% of apartment car parking spaces were empty or unoccupied. So there's kind of a clear gap, I think, between what's been the historic minimum parking provision requirements and what I guess the market demands from that. So there's been a shift away from this kind of standard approach in many locations, and a few examples locally or within Australia and New Zealand, Brisbane City Council, New South Wales, Auckland and Wellington, to name a few. So why has this change come about? Now, Plan for Victoria is a strategic document prepared by the government, and it sets out a long-term vision for the state and some key actions to achieve that vision. So action 5 there is to match car and bike parking requirements and bike facilities with demand. So this is, I guess, in part a goal to really reduce the costs of housing, and that's been a real focus of the state government, particularly when parking is not required, and to also, I guess, as a byproduct of that, reduce traffic congestion. So just as, I guess, a link to car ownership and public transport access that this has been the result of. If you just go to the next slide, Katie, we've just got a figure here from Chris Loader at Charting Transport, which kind of illustrates as of 2010, so some outdated data, but a clear link between areas in green there, which are relatively low car ownership, and proximity to public transport access, which you can kind of see the railway stops and major bus routes on there. So I think there's kind of a clear pattern and probably an implicitly understood relationship between public transport and car access or car ownership, but it's something that's now been kind of implemented in our planning scheme. So the update to Clause 5206 came through 2 days before we closed for business last year, which was fantastic, as part of kind of Planning Scheme Amendment VC 277. So all properties across the state are now separated into a grid within four categories of public transport access, ranging from 1 to 4, 1 being poor or relatively poor, and 4 being very good. Um, so there's associated kind of differing provision requirements based on those categories, and they're derived from what's known as the Public Transport Accessibility Level, PTAL calculation, and that was first implemented in London by Transport for London in around 2004. Interestingly, all the documentation speaks to a 200-meter grid, but they're actually 157 meters. The reason for that, I'm not sure. Um, so I'll just give you a quick overview about how PTAL works. So you can consider this as the effective service frequency of a public transport service, and this is calculated from the center of each one of those blocks. So it considers to each kind of public transport stop within walking distance, the walk time, the peak period service frequency, and I guess the associated wait time from that, and an adjustment for reliability. For buses, it's 2 minutes added to that figure, and for trains and trams, it's 1 minute. Now, I think importantly, this PTAL calculation that underpins the car parking categories is based on a snapshot of services from the morning peak, 8 a.m. till 9 a.m. on a specific date in April of this year. So that means that the maps as they stand don't incorporate any changes to public transport services that have occurred in the interim, and that includes the Melbourne Metro, for example. Nor does it take into consideration any change to services that are planned or in the short term or the long term. And there's a hyperlink there with a fact sheet published by the government just with some extra detail around these calculations, but we'll just walk through a really quick case study. So for this particular site in Brunswick, it's a 4-minute walk to the tram stop in both directions. There's a 2.5-minute average wait time based on a 5-minute headway service, and plus a 1-minute reliability factor gives an access time of 7.5 minutes from this particular location. So we convert that to an equivalent doorstop frequency. So there's effectively 8 services of that an hour. You consider that. And then to get the PTAL, we take the highest or the best service and multiply that by 1. And then for all remaining services, multiply those by half, sum those EDFs, and that gives us a PTAL. So then that PTAL is sorted into 4 bins ranging from 1 to 4 to give us those category 1 to 4 ratings. So that then gives us our differing car parking provision requirements. So you see it on the right-hand side, we have category 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 4 different rates that apply for each land use. So in addition to those changes, there's been some other subtle differences to the table that sets out the parking provision requirements. There are some changes to the kind of standard or highest provision rates in category 1, as well as some changes to the measures in which they're based upon. So for example, the childcare centre is now based on staff rates, whereas previously that used to be based on child rates. So we see across the 4 categories generally reducing car parking provision requirements with increasing public transport access, which I think is a logical outcome. So the minimum provision rates still apply for category 1 and 2 areas, but in categories 3 and 4, where we've got kind of good and very good public transport access, we see the introduction of maximum provision rates. So we just got a sample of rates there, but obviously there's kind of 30 or so of those that are applicable. So that's probably it from me, and I'll pass along to Peter Malley.
Thanks, James. That's a really good rundown of all the controls. I'm going to take a little bit more of a dive into how these are applied to developments and applications, and what we see these controls looking like as things move forwards. Um, we can see, so for those who don't have a lot of context with Clause 5206, as James has said, it was previously set out on the basis of minimum car parking rates. But it did permit the ability to reduce these rates on the provision of a car parking demand assessment being provided. And this remains the same for the new clause as well. Those controls around varying rates still remain largely in place. albeit these controls now apply to the minimum rates in categories 1 and 2 and the maximum rates in categories 3 and 4. So any development that seeks to vary the statutory rates under any category still needs to prepare a car parking demand assessment. And the criteria for a car parking demand assessment have remained largely the same as well. They still need to have regard to car parking demand over time, linked trips, bicycle provision, car ownership, and other empirical data. And equally, these controls apply to both the minimum and maximum areas. The difference comes about when the responsible authority is reviewing these car parking demand assessments, and there are different items for the responsible authority to consider. So under the minimum controls, it is largely the same as the previous system, where there were considerations to availability of on-street parking, any car parking credits or deficiencies that may be associated with a land, or alternate transport choices such as public transport. So no real change in that regard. Under the maximums, things have changed slightly, and so it brings into more intangible elements for consideration, things such as if you want to exceed the maximum provision, does the additional parking impact local amenity? Does it result in a positive urban design outcome? And also it has consideration to the provision of disabled parking. And personally, as a wheelchair user myself, the provision of disabled parking is really important to consider in these maximum car parking areas and is certainly a welcomed addition. When we're considering maximum parking controls that seek to limit the amount of parking, we should be making sure that we're not adversely impacting the ability for people to access the area or the buildings themselves. So what this really means in terms of impact to development, it depends on the land use being proposed. We don't see these controls making any real difference to residential development. In fact, any residential development that's delivered now under the old system, adopting the old car parking rates, would be 100% compliant under the new scheme. So for us, we don't see any change in how car parking demand assessments are undertaken for residential uses. In fact, there's probably going to be less of them. The major impact is likely to be around employment uses. If you go and do some digging into the car parking rates, you'll see that employment uses have significantly reduced car parking requirements and in fact quite low maximum requirements in high PTAL areas. So in applying maximum parking rates to employment uses, we need careful consideration to making sure that the maximum rates actually support the proposed use. And we may actually find that we'll be preparing more car parking demand assessments to exceed maximums for employment uses, specifically to support them and make sure that they're viable. Innominate land uses or land uses that are not listed specifically within the car parking rates are still to be provided to the satisfaction of the relevant authority. The challenge, however, will be aligning these car parking rates or these car parking provisions against the expectations of the PTAL category. So, for example, gymnasiums in a Category 1 area is a very standard assessment and application based on minimum provision. However, how it's expressly set out in a Category 4 maximum area is yet to be fully resolved. The practice note to clause 5206 does set out some guidelines and basic criteria about this, but it is probably needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. The other element to all this is the grandfathering of car parking, and this represents the acknowledgement that land use develops over time and that a development that's delivered now will not necessarily need to accord with the future requirements if public transport is increased. So, for example, an office development, if it's delivered in a Category 1 area and then is converted at a later date to a retail shop use, and it happens to become a Category 4 area due to public transport improvements, how does the maximum of Category 4 apply to a minimum of the development when it was in Category 1? And so in this particular example, we don't need to change the car parking supply on site. It's grandfathered to the development. And we end up with a result that the initial development is supplying car parking at a statutory rate of 3.5 spaces per 100 square metres, rather than the Category 4 rate, which is a 1 space per 100 square metres maximum. So at this stage, it's unclear how this will evolve through activity centres, but we can foresee that as new activity centres evolve, there is the potential to lead to an oversupply of car parking early on. Now, as James alluded to, there was a very brief heads up from the government that this was going to happen. So if we jump to the next slide, Katie, the government have introduced some transition periods, and there's a 6-month period running from 18th December to 16th of June, and it applies to different categories of car parking control. So when we're looking at the minimum car parking rates, so this is your Category 1, Category 2 areas, there is during the 6-month period, the lower of either the old scheme or the new scheme will apply to the site. So this will mean you have to assess it under both schemes in the first instance, and generally it will mean that it results in a lower car parking supply, although there will be a few examples where it is slightly higher under the new system. Importantly, this applies to all active applications at the time of the reform. The next transitional provision is provision B for maximum car parking rate areas. This came into effect immediately as of 18th December. Any application made after the 18th of December is directly impacted by maximum car parking rates. If the application was made before the 18th of December, then the previous scheme still applies, but any new scheme or any new application after the 18th of December is assessed under the maximum car parking rates. And finally, there's transition period C, which is if we're in a parking overlay area. So as James mentioned, a parking overlay is a separate piece of statutory control to a defined area and sets out alternate car parking rates. As of the transition date, so the 18th of December, the parking overlay rates will still apply and they will still override the rates contained within the scheme. Now, the department have committed to liaising with local government to harmonise the parking overlays and the new Clause 5206 over the next 6 months. They however, have not articulated how that will be managed and what the outcomes might be. And so we expect this is something that local government will need to consider and try and get their heads around what those parking overlays were initially intended to do. And this is a very good segue to Chris. Chris will have a quick chat about the implications to local government and the delivery of these changes.
Thank you, Peter. Look, before I begin, I'd like to first just acknowledge today that I stand on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today, as we get into it, I'm going to be speaking, as Peter alluded to there and Katie said earlier, I suppose looking at what the reforms mean from a local government perspective. And I think there's the opportunity, if you want to flick on, Katie, there's the opportunity as we think about it from a local government perspective that we could consider it from both a positive or negative perspective. I think I've taken the view to think of local government having the opportunity to really supercharge the reforms to ensure that they're delivering on the outcomes that have been intended by the state in putting them together. On the face of it, for local government, the local government's role in reviewing planning applications in many instances will be simplified in those category 2, 3 and 4 areas where lower rates have been applied and maximum rates now apply. And in category 1 areas, in reality, it's going to remain largely unchanged. The reduced requirements for parking in category 2 areas and the use of those maximum rates gives developers greater flexibility in how they respond and to drive the market expectation, I suppose, in how they respond in that regard. But permits to reduce parking requirements at the fringes of these accessibility categories would still be expected to come into councils, and there may be that element of thought process, as Peter alluded to, of getting those, considering those rates right when maximum rates apply, and does that align with what some of the expectations are and the needs of the market. I think communication is going to be really important between local government and developers to ensure that there's a clear understanding that On-street parking may not necessarily be ongoing, and the onus to provide parking through all of their considerations, falls on the developer. And I think this change makes that clearer even more than before, that the onus is on the developer to be able to make sure that they're providing what's needed. If you want to flick on to that next one, I think in regard to category 2, 3, and 4 areas where we've moved away from setting parking rates that reflect the likely demand of parking and setting, I suppose, nominal or a bit more nominal rates and reduced rates to give developers flexibility to respond. To go with this is going to be the need to really effectively manage on-street car parking if we're going to see these mode shift outcomes occur as intended by the introduction of these reforms. And it's going to be really important to make sure that we see these mode shift outcomes occur rather than it being simply just a shifting of parking locations from off-street developer-provided parking to on-street parking, where developers have the opportunity to choose to provide less parking. We've seen this over in New Zealand with the parking reforms that they had over there, where they removed all parking rates nationwide. But now they're going through a process of local councils having to step back and put in place extensive parking management plans to be able to make sure that, again, those outcomes aren't just simply about a relocation of parking to on-street, with developers being able to choose what they want to do in that regard. Hopefully we're going to be able to achieve that end outcome of changing the way in which people travel. Now, that may be proactively managing on-street car parking. It may also be setting up strategies or policies to enable that clear, consistent and transparent method to managing car parking should overspill begin to occur, depending on the positions that new developments take in terms of the amount of car parking that they're going to choose to provide on their sites. Shared car parking outcomes in activity centres where maximum rates now apply also become a bit more difficult for councils to achieve unless councils choose to fully fund those types of outcomes occurring. Where maximum car parking rates apply, there's not the same ability for councils to be able to build car parking and collect cash in lieu contributions to fund those shared car parking outcomes. So there's the potential that there's greater pressure placed on council finances in some instances where we want to see those shared kind of outcomes occurring within activity centres rather than parking being provided on individual properties. And again, that element of communication is going to be really key to that, to be able to drive those outcomes. From a communication perspective, I think that is going to be really important from a local council perspective and from a number of perspectives. Councils are going to need to engage with developers to set the expectations regarding parking overspill and what's going to happen either now or in the future in terms of the way in which car parking is managed on street, to make sure that developers are responding and providing the right amount of car parking that they need to provide within their sites. I think there's a really big role, touching on that shared car parking element that I spoke about before, in regard to councils engaging with developers about the opportunities to explore creating those shared parking outcomes within our activity centres, where we want to see those efficiencies in car parking being provided, where we want to see that land use being put in the right place and not necessarily being governed by parking on many individual sites. So there's a lot of communication that has to happen from that perspective. From a community perspective, councils are going to need to set that understanding with the community and maybe reset that understanding with the community as to who's responsible for providing car parking. That is not necessarily, if developers are choosing to not provide as much car parking because they have that option with under a maximum rate outcome, that it's not necessarily council's responsibility to come along and pick up any slack in demand that might be occurring, but it's council's role to manage that on-street asset, the public asset, but with a view of that end outcome of actually achieving change in the way in which people travel, changing mode shift and those outcomes within activity centres is really important. I think there's going to be some really tricky discussions as well and engagement in that regard, in regard to those precinct parking outcomes. And that we'll likely see the cost of those type of solutions, whether it's provided by councils or whether it's provided by private developers, but the cost of those transferred to the users. And I think that expectation is probably going to, or that occurrence is going to come to fruition more and more. But that impact and the need for communication between councils and the community is going to be really important. And then thirdly, I've just got up there, the communication with local councillors is going to be important as well. The goalposts have shifted in this reform about what's expected of developers, the way in which they can provide car parking and respond. And we need to get councillors on board from that perspective to make sure that they're understanding how those goalposts have shifted and the roles that they have to play in that regard. And also to encourage them to be open, I suppose, from those consideration around those different funding paths that are potentially might need to be considered to achieve these precinct type solutions in activity centres. And finally, and look, Peter touched on it just before in regard to parking overlays. Parking overlays are going to, they currently exist. They'll continue to exist. The state government will work to augment the existing parking overlays that exist within the system, but they're still going to remain, and they're still going to have an important role, either the ones that exist or other ones that might need to be created in the future. The current PTAL rating system is based on the here and now. Parking overlays provide that potential mechanism to take that forward-looking response to parking in the context of expected changes in public transport and accessibility that might come to centres in both brownfield and greenfield contexts in that regard. So there's a real opportunity for parking overlays to still need to take into account that consideration, maybe those stepping stones to move forward that need to be thought through in between that here and now element and what it is going to look like in the future. And parking overlays also provide us with the opportunity to look at setting reduced maximum rates in key centres. The residential car parking rates, for example, I think provide a very flexible ability for developers to respond and provide residential car parking. But there's the opportunity for maximum rates, to be considered in key centres where we need to constrain parking supply, where we need to manage congestion to address travel demands. At the source, where we might need to use a parking overlay to also think about how we might need to further reduce those flexible arrangements that are built in at the moment to respond to the specific and unique characteristics of particular areas. So look, let me quickly wrap up. Look, from a local government perspective, I think the Victorian parking reforms have great aspirations to achieve many outcomes that are being sought, whether it's mode shift, placemaking, urban design improvements, improving development feasibility. There's many great aspirations, but I think there's some heavy lifting that's going to need to be done by local governments to realise those aspirations. So I think local governments really have that really key role, and as I said at the start, are really the people now that there's a framework in place, but local governments are going to play a really key role to supercharging these reforms to making sure that they're achieving those end outcomes that have been sought at the outset. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Katie to take us through the next case study sessions.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Now, I think we've all got a pretty good understanding, at least, of what they are, how they kind of implicate for our development side, and also what it means for council looking forward and how we can use some of our existing things like parking overlays to really get things going. Now, before I jump to the first case study, I did want to just ask all three of you if you had an answer to Chris de Grooter's on the call, and he did put a question in there, which is, has there been any indication yet as to when updated bicycle parking requirements will come out? Have any of you heard or inquired?
As far as I'm aware, they're on their way, but that's all. I don't know. Hopefully others have heard a more definitive date, but yeah.
No specifics to my knowledge.
Right, we will keep our eye out for that one, and as soon as they come online, we'll maybe get you all back on board again for another session and see how the reforms are going when we've got bicycle as well. But I will jump into the first case study. So this was quite an interesting one here out in Broad Meadows. So we have a commercial zone 2 site, and I will attempt to turn the laser on. Do bear with me. Commercial zone 2 site on the right-hand side here in our car parking requirement map. And we are in a car parking category 1 zone. But as Peter pointed out when he suggested this case study, in the very tippy-toppy left corner of the site, we do actually have a little bit of category 2. So I'm going to start with you, James. How should practitioners interpret sites that straddle 2 parking categories under the car parking requirement map? And which category should we generally use?
So the planning seems quite clear. So we adopt the higher category rate or the lower parking provision rate, even if it's just touching. So if it's in, it's in.
Thank you. And then I guess, Peter, that leads on to you, which is from a developer perspective, how does a split category site affect the feasibility and parking design, particularly when only a small portion of that land is actually in the higher category?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Like James said, if it's in, it's in. So statutorily, this is a category 2 assessment. But ultimately, I think it comes down to the land use and what you're trying to achieve. In this particular case, it's an industrial use which has a statutory requirement under category 1 of 2.9 spaces per 100. But under category 2, it's zero point 0.4. It's 80% less than the category 1 rate. So, on the face of it, a developer can reduce their car parking area and increase the floor area. But what the advice that we're giving is that you need to look at it contextually. And in this particular instance, the applicant was looking at providing 1 space per 100, which was consistent with other development in the area and was based on staffing numbers. And so they'd made the commercial decision that it was better to provide enough parking for staff and have a leasable facility than, dropping the parking provision all the way down to, I think it was like 90 spaces or something. So I think the market will respond to it in itself, and it gives the market that flexibility to then respond to what they're trying to do and who the future tenants are going to be.
Very nice. And then I guess when we're putting these applications in, Chris, how was council likely to assess when there's a split category here? And what level of justification, I guess, would they expect to see for applications coming through?
Okay, as has been said already, I suppose councils, will need to, in this example, decide in accordance with the scheme, and and in this case, it would expect that the high category will apply. There's not necessarily a justification that needs to be provided by the developer to go and justify why they're applying the higher category or anything like that. I think though, in these kind of cases where you've got these, I suppose, on the fringes of the categories where the categories meet, they're probably those kind of red flag areas for councils where they need to be thinking about, that need for parking management and what's going to happen in the surrounding area, depending on what the developer is going to do. The developer, takes that role of saying, yeah, I'm going to provide all the car parking I need on site, then that's great. But they could also choose to say, well, we're just going to rely upon, the residential streets that you can see to the north of this particular site that are currently unrestricted, would allow, staff or workers to be able to park there all day with no requirement for justification from a developer in that regard. So I think these fringe areas are areas where councils are going to need to be looking and thinking about, okay, how do we manage car parking in those surrounding areas? And I think there's a really key role as well, just again, that communication to be discussing with developers, the councils making it clear that, this availability of on-street car parking, parking in the residential streets and those kind of things, it may not continue into the future in that regard. It may be restricted and it may change the ability for your staff to be able to access your site. So think about not just relying upon available parking because it's free in the area, but also making sure you're doing your due diligence to make sure that your site is accessible by the people that need to use it both now and also in the future if things change. So, yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think, and all three of you pointed out, I know James and Peter definitely did, that jump between category 1 and 2 is quite significant. So in these areas, really making sure we're having, 1, the foresight for what happens in the future, and also 2, understanding the implications for council and the surrounding area, really important in these areas. Now, jumping into another case study, and this one I guess is kind of what I would call like the opposite situation, where we're in Richmond for this one, and we have a neighbourhood residential zone. And for this one, we are looking at this parcel here in McGrath Court. If you can hopefully see the laser if it works. This parcel here in McGrath Court, where we have a little bit of Category 1 put in. And then, if it doesn't really show clearly on the map, but we can actually see as well that there is a little connection through here through a laneway that goes straight to Church Street and allows for pretty much a 1 minute walk to a tram, and I think under 4 minutes to East Richmond Station. Now, Peter, how should applicants manage expectations, I guess, of clients, architects, whoever it may be, when you've got a well-located inner city area, but you're mapped in a conservative way. So you've got a Category 1, but you're very close to public transport. How should we deal with this?
I think it's important to note that the PTEL mapping is data driven and it's based purely on the data and doesn't have any strategic context. And so if you look around the mapping all across Melbourne, you end up with these funny little pockets simply because it's so arbitrary. And I think that's something that we all need to be aware of when we're looking at these maps across at all levels, whether it's the applicant or myself or local government. And I think it's that sort of higher level awareness that we all need to bring to this, and we do need to engage early on. Now, the decision guidelines are all there, and they do allow you to vary the parking rates, and you can put forward arguments around surrounding accessibility and zoning and categories and use that. And it's ultimately up at the discretion of the local government to make that call as to whether or not, in this case, whether or not it's Category 4 or a Category 1. To us, like looking at this, it probably all seems quite logical. And we just get it done. So I think what I would be saying is that in the very first instance in sites like this is to engage early with all parties, making sure that everyone's aware of it, and going to government at the first instance and querying it and making sure that we're all across it to make sure that we're getting the right outcomes for the area.
Yeah, nice. I think that, Chris, that leads on to you straight away, which is, yeah, how can councils address situations like this in their local government areas?
Yeah, look, I think, look, there's, as it's just been said, there's a recognition that a line has to be drawn somewhere. And in some instances, you'll fall on one side of the line, and in the other instance, you'll fall on the other side of the line. It doesn't mean that there's, massively significant difference between the two properties that are on either side of that line. So we do need to be wary of that. I think, as has been said as well, the fact we've still got a planning system. We've still got a planning system that has decision guidelines. It's not a planning system that says you are in this category and therefore there is no way to think about an alternative outcome. We've got decision guidelines within the planning scheme that are set there for good reason, to be able to give consideration to those local circumstances that might come, recognising that we've got a system that applies to the state, albeit is tailored because of these mapping elements of things. But those decision guidelines are the best starting point in terms of considering what an alternate outcome might be and what alternate outcomes might be appropriate, and those steps to be able to work through. In these anomalies as well that might feel like they exist, I suppose it's probably an opportunity to go back and think about some of those metrics that have been used in establishing those PTEL ratings as well, and just thinking through what they have been, and is there something like this little local connection that's potentially been missed or not recognised in those categories that might help to justify why an alternate outcome could be appropriate in this instance.
No, thank you. And I'm actually just going to jump to Jodie Place's question here, which James, feel free to answer, or Chris or Peter as well. I guess in these kind of areas here where you've got enforced lower parking rates, is there a conflict between the economic viability of major retail centres for these? And so I guess some attract significant customer base and from the area, which are not well serviced by public transport. So what would you do in that situation?
Well, I think it's interesting that there are going to be, I guess, some suppressive effects on car parking provisions, probably if you're adopting the default requirements, some of these locations, and some land uses that do like to provide a lot of car parking. thinking like a home improvement store or something like that, they might find themselves kind of, I guess, by default forced to provide less car parking than they prefer. But like the guys have said, there's the decision guidelines are there to allow for some flexibility, and hopefully you can kind of bring some sense to some of these kind of perhaps more stranger outcomes from the rates.
I think I'd like to add on to that too is that, and drawing on from this whole P-tail is just data, is there's no real consideration to amenity of an area. And so if you look at P-tail that's applied in other locations around the world, there's also a metric that deals with the amenity of the area as well. It's not just straight on the public transport access. And so when we're looking at a situation like this in Richmond with, high levels of amenity and high levels of dwelling density, the economic side of things is, you've got a catchment which is so dense and so close, car parking becomes less relevant. But the further out you go in the different P-tail categories and, parking rates doesn't accept that level of amenity as a control.
And now I'll quickly jump to the next case study. And I can see there's questions flying in. So again, Peter, Chris, James, feel free to put them in as you see fit. But I'll just jump to the next one, which we're now looking at what is the Nightingale Brunswick East side. So it's again, hopefully my laser works. Here we go. There's a little site here right near the trams and right near Nicholson Street. So we're a commercial zone 1. We do have a parking overlay here. So we are in column B rates as per the parking overlay. We have quite a good apartment mix, just under 40 apartments, and 5 commercial properties. And we do have a total of 20 car parking spaces for the entire site. And of course, 14 of those are dedicated to car share. Now, Chris, I'll start with you. How might councils use examples like this one to inform, I guess, future parking policy or even a review of the overlay that's currently on this site?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one in this regard. I think there's circumstances like these that might give rise to the consideration to, I suppose, reducing parking under a maximum rate that applies. And in the old scheme of things, in considering those reductions of car parking, I suppose councils have the opportunity to some extent negotiate some of those outcomes of other provisions, whether it's green travel plans, whether it's excessive provisions of bicycle parking, whether it's being the provision of car share, whether it's the provision of making sure that there's disabled parking provided and those kind of things. I think that's one aspect that moving to this maximum rate system, it gives people that automatic ability to think about what they're providing. But there's other elements of things that councils have been able to negotiate to be able to influence the way in which people will travel and to enable access to these kind of sites as well, are going to be a bit more voluntary, I suppose, rather than necessarily being able to be built into that negotiation element of reducing the car parking requirement side of things. So I think there's that opportunity as well then for some of these areas for councils to be thinking about some of those, from that parking overlay perspective and that kind of thing. Are there requirements for these types of measures that we need to be able to put in place to still ensure those outcomes are achieved, whether it's, as we said, green travel plans and all those types of initiatives that come out of those, excessive bicycle parking. Now we'll wait and see what that change, that update to the clause comes out with in terms of those expectations. But, car share vehicles, disabled parking, those kind of things, that opportunity to think through, do we need to augment parking overlays and those types of things to be able to catch some of those elements of things in there.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
And someone's actually just put the question in there, which I think flows nicely, which is for shared car parking arrangements, do cash and lieu schemes still work, especially when there's P-tail category 3 and 4 and the maximums are apply?
Yeah, well, look, it's an interesting one. Once you've got a maximum rate, then a cash in lieu provision, and I'll try to be brief. You could probably set me off on an hour-long discussion on this one, but cash in lieu is when you're providing cash in response to a reduction in the amount of car parking that you're providing on the site. When you are in a maximum rate scenario, then there is no ability for a council to request a cash in lieu provision to be provided in that way. So that opportunity disappears when you're in a maximum rate environment. Whether there's opportunities to think through that from a different perspective, from a development contributions perspective, needs to be thought through. But it's obviously a different requirement in that sense to one of which is a cash in lieu of providing the car parking.
No, thank you. And Peter, I'll jump to you now for this one because it's very interesting with the commercial uses here.
Mhm.
So someone's asked, apparently you mentioned that there may be some increase in permit applications to actually increase maximum rates because for especially non-resi uses in these Cat 3 and 4.
Yep.
Do you think council will look on these permit applications favourably in support of these commercial rates, or how do you think these will apply?
Oh, well, gazing into my crystal ball, look, it's very hard to tell, and obviously, I think it needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. I mean, a lot of this applies to activity centres, which are in themselves employment zones, and so we need to be fostering that synergy between an employment zone and having residents who live near their work, 20-minute cities, that whole sort of thing. So I would have thought there's going to be a balance between it. Some of it will be, okay, we're trying to get people to live where they work, and so we don't need car parking, but we also need to recognize that this mapping system doesn't have any consideration to where public transport's coming from or going to, or whether it, serves an appropriate alternative to private vehicle use. So, I think the short answer is I don't know, but I would like to think that yes, on the economic basis of trying to grow these activity centres, there would be some allowance to go beyond the maximums for a commercial use or an employment use.
Can I just add to that briefly? Yeah, I think there's a need in that case to think beyond. I suppose there's the economic side of things as to what is right to make a development work, but what is the impact as well that goes from. Previously we talk about, what's the impact of reducing car parking? What's the impact of increasing parking to this area from a traffic perspective, from a amenity perspective, from an overspill perspective, and all those kind of things? What's that flow-on impact that's going to occur that we might need to think through?
No, thank you. I'm going to jump to James now quickly. We're still on this case study. You shared the transport versus car ownership map before, and someone's kind of just asked here, should existing car ownership rates be considered as part of the PTAL rating for residential areas? It seems like there would be more accurate reflection of public transport access than the data set that has been utilised. And can you talk to, I guess, how PTAL and that actual map maybe relate to each other?
Well, it's interesting because there was another point in there about the removal of the number of bedrooms as a measure for dwellings. And so we've seen across the years a really clear relationship between the number of bedrooms and the car ownership for a particular dwelling. Obviously increasing, and implication being more people in the household, more cars typically. So that's been removed. Um, I presume for simplicity, but it's a little bit unclear. Um, I would have no idea how you'd implement those two things at the same time, public transport and car ownership. But I think there's certainly merits in I guess in a situation where you do have to vary the car parking requirements to have a look at what are the typical measures of or typical levels of car ownership for a particular dwelling. And I think one of the more interesting things to come out of this change around residential parking requirements is that the maximum provision rates, and I think Chris mentioned this earlier, are still 2 spaces per dwelling in Category 4 areas. So there is really no suppressive effect of the changes on car parking provision for residential uses. It's really, well, unlike there are for other uses like office, which has a kind of very low provision rate in Category 4. Yeah, so I think we'll kind of wait and see how this all fleshes out. We still haven't had too many projects go through, but yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that works.
No, thank you. Now, before I know there's a lot more questions in there, but I did want to get to this last case study because it is a little bit more, I guess, outer/middle Melbourne, which might be interesting to some people here. We're now looking at Noble Park. So we are just outside of the new activity centre range that's been released by the Department of Transport. We're looking at existing childcare in this one, which has 18 car parking spaces on site. There's no current PT on the site's frontage, but approximately 400 metres away, both to the north and south, there are bus routes that do exist. So I'm going to start with James. How does the PTAL method account for future or potential public transport upgrades, such as if a bus was rerouted in front of the site?
So it doesn't. Um, the government's committed to updating the PTAL mapping each year to reflect changes in public transport services in the intervening period, but there is no kind of forward-looking component to the PTAL methodology. And I think that's particularly interesting in areas like this where it's, we're likely to have service changes and as well as kind of town centres in growth areas where it's kind of identified as potentially a transit hub. But there are no buses there. There might not even be any roads there. But someone might be wanting to develop a supermarket, for example. Um, so yeah, no provision for forward looking at this stage.
Thank you. But Peter, for example, if there was future public transport changes in front of the site, such as a improved bus, improved train, etc., how can we consider this in our planning applications, particularly where those changes maybe not yet committed, but are definitely foreseeable as part of work such as the Activity Centre program?
Yeah, it really comes down to the strategic context. As James said, without any commitment in the mapping to have been changed to account for future services, it's really difficult to draw a very concise argument. And so we probably need to look at the strategic planning of it. Particularly when we're talking with future activity centres that will absolutely be providing these future assets. I think that's really simple conversation to have because we know they're coming online. For this particular site, if Chandler Road was to be a future bus route, that's subject to a funding requirement and patronage assessments, and it's a really hard one to consider. In this particular context, we may even find that because we've got the train line to the south, should additional services be provided, then that category two might creep a little bit further because, going back to James's calculations at the very start of how PTAL's determined, increased services will change how these things are done. So it's very hard to capture, and I think we've just got to draw those really long sort of strategic views to these things and in context of the strategic importance of the site being considered as well.
No, thank you. And then Chris, I guess from the council point of view, what can they do as well in policies, overlays, etc., to help, I guess, capture broader transport planning and make sure that we can get these infrastructure on the ground?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, and probably putting aside maybe this singular childcare centre site example, but councils have the opportunity, maybe it's even better, the responsibility, I suppose, to be able to use parking overlays as that mechanism. As I said earlier, they exist, and I see that they're going to continue to exist. But using those parking overlays as mechanisms to bridge that gap between the current accessibility and the future accessibility, and to put in place those, I suppose, a stepped approach to be able to bridge that gap between them and see how we can move towards what's required now and what might be required in the future. So I think, yeah, on the face of it, we could turn around and look at it and think, we've now just got these maximum rate requirements or these change requirements. There's a lot less need for parking overlays. I think there's very much still that role for them within activity centres, as I said earlier, between brownfield and greenfield activity centres that are going to see change. That there's that role for the parking overlays to be able to create that policy and that bridge between the now and the future.
No, thank you. Now, I'm conscious of time and there are quite a few questions, which I think need probably a little bit more time to answer than a very quick yes, no. So we will try and answer some of those, I guess, over the next coming days and get some responses back to you. But I did want to finish with two questions to all three of you before we leave. The first one being, will government allow for changes to PTAL ratings based on ground truth as part of their 12 monthly PTAL reviews? And what are your thoughts, all three of you, on just having a 12 monthly review of the PTAL rates?
I'll just quickly jump off on the first point. I'm not aware of any process in which we can raise kind of clear issues with the mapping. We'll see if that does come out, but I know there are quite a few examples where kind of there's some interesting or strange results like the one we presented today.
Yeah, I think in regard to the second point about every 12 months, I think is probably too often. If we consider how this infrastructure is delivered and operated, services don't change on that frequent a basis, and they're largely tied to big infrastructure upgrades. So I think probably every 2 to 3 years is probably a better metric, but it also then provides a little bit more stability. I mean, this is the only dynamic control in the planning system. Conceivably, if things were updated on a 12-month basis and a new bus route came along, your category would change overnight on a particular site, which I think creates a lot more headache. So probably a bigger window is a better outcome.
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting one. We probably need to start somewhere in that regard. And I think in the first instance, that 12-month thought process is probably, without contradicting what you've just said there, Peter, maybe a good starting point at least. Let's have this in place for a year. Let's see how it's gone. Let's update it in a year's time. See how things have changed. See how dynamic that change is in that regard. I think it's something that, maybe that continued thought process and review may need to change as we move forward. I think, let's start it. Let's start at a year at least for the first year. Let's see how it changed, and then let's take the opportunity to reflect, I suppose, at the end of that year, at that first opportunity to review it and see what that next iteration might be, and whether to your point, it pushes a bit further, or it stays to where it is. But it's a starting point. I think it needs to, we can evolve from there, I think.
No, thank you. And one last question, which I'm hoping will be a yes, no from all three of you, because we are all from consulting firms here. Do you think these changes will reduce the number of traffic/parking reports that traffic engineers will need to prepare for applications?
Probably. Selfishly, I hope not, but I think for, I guess, more broadly the community to smooth the planning process and make it simpler, I think it's a better outcome.
I'm not sure that it'll necessarily change anything. I think a lot of the work that's already been done in activity centres is largely what is already being done and what we're supporting. So I don't think it will change that. If anything, I think it means we're providing more advice behind the scenes to the applicants to make sure that they're putting the right product out and it's not detrimental to the local area. I think that's probably where the bigger work is going to be.
Yeah. Look, I probably agree with what you just said there, Peter. That I think, look, ultimately, there's probably some reduction in some of the simple applications that aren't going to need to be put through the same process that they once were. So it'll simplify it from that perspective, I think. But I still think there's the continued role, the continued dynamic. It probably, as you alluded to, it changes the dynamic of the advice that's being requested. It's no longer how, what's the rate and how low does it need to go to be right, but it's actually, flipping that argument and saying how much do I need to provide to make sure is aligning with what the customer, the market that we're catering for needs to ensure accessibility is achieved in that regard. So I think it will continue, but it'll change slightly in that emphasis.
No, I definitely agree. I think it definitely changes the way we probably give advice, and probably goes on to the point of, bringing transport on early can sometimes saves you a whirl of pain down the end of the line. But unfortunately, we've gone a little bit over, so I am very sorry. We had quite a few people drop off, but we will try and answer all those questions over the next coming days and get some back to you, because there were some amazing ones there that had a lot of reactions on them as well. But otherwise, thank you to all three of you, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure. As always, keep the conversation going beyond this meeting. Give any one of our speakers today a call, an email, have a chat to them about car parking if you've got any questions. And I hope we'll see everyone again at any upcoming TPA and VPLA events over the next couple of months / rest of the year. So thank you all.